Okay. Thanks, Ariel. We can go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So today we will be taking you on a bit of a journey over the next hour. We'll spend about 40 minutes discussing the content, and then we have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. Do feel free to type any questions that you have throughout the presentation into the chat box. We are looking forward to being able to engage and participate with you throughout the presentation. So feel free to jump in and to take yourself off of mute if you'd like to participate. So we'll begin today by talking a bit more about ChildFun International and the U.S. government and global advocacy work that we do here in D.C. and around the world. And then we'll jump into the topics of education and violence prevention and how we can make the connections between our local education and violence situation into the global experience of children in global education and those who may experience violence in their communities. After which, we'll dive into a structured strategy session around in-district advocacy tactics that you can use to advance your advocacy goals back in district after you've completed your DC trip and have met with your members of Congress here. And we have two very practical tools that you can use in those efforts, a personal narrative exercise and an epic laser talk. And then finally, and I believe most exciting for you all, is to hear directly from our youth ambassador and program director from Operation Shoestring in Jackson, Mississippi, to talk about their experience working with ChildFun and in district with the Jackson Public School, and local government, and the kinds of in-district advocacy tactics and strategies that they've been able to use in Jackson. I think it will be very inspiring and may give you a lot of ideas on how you can take back this kind of work into your home districts. All right, next slide, please. Thank you, Ariel. So a bit more about ChildFun International. Our mission is to help all children have the capacity to improve their lives and become young adults, parents, and leaders who bring lasting and positive change in their communities. So we are a child-focused development organization. We have 80 years of experience. And we work in communities throughout the world, in Asia, in Africa, and including the United States and the Americas region. And we work to address the underlying conditions that prevent children and youth from reaching their potential and contributing to society in positive ways. So we currently operate in 25 countries, and we reach over 11 million children and family members. And we do our work through implementing local partners who have a deep understanding of the communities that they're serving and the needs that are in those communities. So we are a member of a larger global alliance, the ChildFun Alliance. This is a network of 11 other organizations that are child-focused and serving children in over 54 countries. So our reach is wide, and we operate using a life stage approach. And what that means is that we focus our work on working with and for children and youth across the continuum of their lifespan. So the first decades of life from conception to 5 years. Life stage 2 would be from 6 to 14 years, and then life stage 3 from 15 to 24 years. And so we use this approach to tailor our interventions to ensure that we're meeting children where they are at their developmental stage and at every age and every stage. If I could just ask if folks could put themselves on mute, it might reduce some of the background noise that we're hearing. We'd appreciate that. Or maybe, Ariel, you could manually mute. Thank you so much. So our fundamental principles, we work on 6 fundamental principles, a child's rights-based approach, and we focus on the root causes of poverty. We use data and evidence to inform our programming, and we believe that children and youth are the agents of change, and so youth voice and participation is fundamental in our work. And lastly, we work through local partnerships, and we focus on long-term sustainability. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. As I mentioned, ChildFun works through our local partner organizations, including in the United States, and Operation Shoestring that you'll hear from in just a minute is one of our strongest partners in the United States. And these local partners throughout the world really understand the communities that they're working in and their needs, and so they are able to network with other local organizations to advance a broad spectrum of society. So we believe that local ownership is fundamental to bringing about the sustainable change that we're seeking, and that working together we can share our resources and our knowledge and our experience and have a greater impact in the communities that we're serving and in institutions for the future. So in 2017, ChildFun operated in 25 countries with 326 local implementing partners. We have a wide reach, and that impact led to reaching 11.4 million children and families. Next slide, please. So we're very excited to share with you a bit more about the programming work that we do with youth. So that would be ages 15 and up. And we know that globally there are 1.2 billion people who are aged 15 to 24 in the world. So young people really represent a diverse and a vibrant generation, and we believe that their participation in development and in crafting solutions for our future is vital and is at the core and the center of our work. To be more effective partners, we realize that young people need to gain certain sets of skills and have access to services and also be provided with a platform in order to achieve the improved economic and physical and social well-being and to be catalysts for the change in their families, in their schools, in their communities, and across the globe. And we know that investment in youth at this stage really pays off, especially when the investment is directed to providing youth with access to things like safe and sustainable employment, to supporting the formation of their sexual and reproductive life, and most vital to this conversation is in facilitating their participation in the lives of their families and their schools and their communities. So the goal of our Life Stage 3 focus is skilled and involved youth. And it's to provide young people, including girls and boys, with the means to become skilled, employable, civically engaged partners who are able to confidently access services and speak up to generating leadership in their community. So I wanted to draw your attention to the bottom half of this slide where it says youth are change agents in their family and community. And wanted to recognize that our civic engagement and our leadership programs, they work to mobilize families and communities and local and national governments in order to support young people to come together in an appropriate safe space and to collectively reflect on the experiences that they have in their families and their schools and their communities, and to share those opinions and those reflections with each other and to plot a course of action that contributes to positive change in their communities. And we'll hear an example of that from our partners, Operation Shoestring, when they discuss the amazing work that they've been able to do through the Youth Ambassador program that really gives a space for youth to reflect and to contribute and lead change efforts in their community. Just for some background, in addition to the U.S. program example that you'll hear from today, I wanted to share a couple of global examples of work that youth your age are doing around the world to use their voice to speak up for change in their communities. In Sierra Leone, ChildFun is training teenage girls in leadership, in community mobilization, peer education, in problem solving, and then in advocacy so that they can engage their peers and their traditional community leaders in the fight against child marriage and in other forms of gender-based violence. Another example is in Uganda. The government partners with the U.S. government, the Center for Disease Control, and with support from ChildFun, we conducted the Violence Against Children survey, which measured physical, psychological, and sexual violence against girls and boys in the entire country of Uganda. And ChildFun's role in that was conducting the survey with young people ages 13 to 24. And the findings from that survey really pinpointed the specific risks that children and youth are facing in Uganda, and they advocated with the Ugandan government to use that data to develop a national action plan to address violence against children. So those are just two examples of a community-based mobilization effort and then a national policy advocacy-based effort to show you really the power that youth voice has in creating sustainable change that we seek in our communities. Next slide, please. Thanks, Ariel. And I believe most of you should be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals already, but I just wanted to back up and explain quickly that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the entire global community has rallied around ensuring that these 17 goals are what all of our energy and our focus and our time and our resources are being poured into in achieving. And these goals were developed with the support of 190 governments through the United Nations and other forums. And just to reiterate that, these 17 development goals, they seek to realize the human rights of everyone and to achieve things like gender equality, the empowerment of all women and girls, things like ending poverty, ending hunger, providing safe access to health services. And in this presentation, we'll be focusing primarily on seeking change around Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is a quality education that every child has a right to receive. And then SDG number 16, peace and justice, which talks about ending abuse and exploitation and trafficking and all forms of violence against children. So as an organization, ChildFun supports all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but our work really focuses on those few that we just mentioned. And just to state that along with the ChildFun Alliance and our peer organizations, including Operation Shoestring and I believe including GCE, we were part of a global movement called Free from Violence campaign, and this gathered the opinions about violence against children from children directly. And our country offices around the world were part of this survey and advocated with their respective governments around actually getting SDG 16, the peace and justice, getting the goal 16.2, which sits under that, ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against children, and getting that on the map. So, the global community really rallied, and we mobilized all of our advocacy efforts to ensure that each one of these Sustainable Development Goals was on the global agenda. And this really dictates, the funding and the research and the program priorities at a global level. So just to highlight, there's some really excellent resources out there about the SDGs, and it's a wonderful resource or wonderful framework in which to continue your developing your research and your knowledge on this topic.
Amber, this is Julia Campbell. I'm also with ChildFun, but I just wanted to make a point about the Sustainable Development Goals that she mentioned, this surveying that went on. And so again, that surveying did include young people from Jackson, Mississippi, as well as our other target areas within the U.S. And again, I just wanted to point out the importance of these are usually young people whose voices are not included in this type of thing. So that in itself was even an advocacy effort in terms of them having input very early on into what eventually became these sustainable goals, that they had some say in again, things like quality education and peace and justice being included in those. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julia. That's so true. And just another demonstration of the importance of youth participation in the global conversations that really shape the development sector are so critical. Next slide, please. So a bit on our advocacy agenda. So I know you all are coming to Washington, D.C. in June, and I'm sure you're getting very excited to meet with your members of Congress, and maybe you already have in the past. Maybe you're already meeting in district with your elected officials. But just wanted to share, why it's so important to advocate with the United States government at a national level, but then also the rest of the presentation will focus on bringing that into your district and really looking at in-district community level advocacy strategies. So you know that our members of Congress are elected to represent us, and their job is to listen to the issues that you care about. You are their constituent, and they represent the districts that you live in. And we recognize that child rights are human rights, and as a global leader, the United States has a moral responsibility to ensure that we're upholding child rights here in our own country, in our own communities, as well as globally throughout the world. We know that the U.S. is the largest contributor to international aid, and so at ChildFun, our advocacy efforts support policies that impact positively the lives of children, especially in the areas of child protection and in global education and maternal child health. So we engage in broad coalition efforts, including GCE, to protect foreign aid, and I know you'll talk more about that in future trainings, but just to reiterate that the importance of really advocating for policies, for programs, as well as for funding, because without the funding, the programs can't take place. So it's just as important to advocate and to lobby for continued robust resources as it is to ensure effective policies and programs. Next, please. Okay, so here is where I hope that we can hear a bit more from you all on the line when we talk about, I'd like to open the topic of education. And I'd like to invite you to take yourself off of mute and to share with us, why is education important to you, and how do you experience your own education? Thinking through these questions, what are some of the issues that you or your peers have faced related to your education, and what kind of barriers are there in your town?
This is LaToya Washington from Operation Shoestring. I'm a youth programs intern. And I know one of the main issues that we wanted to make available when we were in Washington for the time that we were advocating was our inaccess to quality education and just a lack of exposure to resources that we really need. A lot of things that I feel like youth need today aren't openly provided. And that's was one of our biggest concerns, not being able to reach the things that we needed in order to be successful, and what adults and youth could do with that information to better make those things available. And that was, I know, a big part where we still currently advocate in trying to provide spaces for improvements and innovations with Jackson's school district.
Thank you so much for sharing, LaToya. Would anyone else like to share about their personal experience with education in your city or in your school?
Well, Amber, I can also lift up another very recent issue in terms of barriers to education was where our school district was potentially going to be taken over by the state based upon some accreditation standards that they were not meeting, and so essentially no longer having local control. And we felt it was really important, especially in the state of Mississippi, given that our school district, of which we are a part of, is the largest African-American school district in the state of Mississippi. And then also it's one of the only urban school districts. And to kind of echo what LaToya said, that we found that a lot of the resources that we needed for our schools were not being provided. So we were really concerned about what no longer having local control actually meant and the ramifications for those students that we serve here in Jackson.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, LaToya and Amber. And I would imagine that others on the phone might be able to, especially if they're coming from kind of bigger cities, might be able to relate to that experience. And we would encourage folks to continue to share in the chat box if you have additional insight that you'd like to share with the group about how you experience your education and what kind of barriers there might be in your community. And I'll take this opportunity to shift a little bit, to shift our focus from if we realize that we experience our education in a certain way, and there might be certain barriers like LaToya and like Amber may have just mentioned, but have we really ever taken an opportunity to take a step back and to hear about how other children throughout the U.S. as well as throughout the world experience their education? And so I wanted to share with you all a quote from a girl in our program in India. Her name is Shubhwati. And the quote is telling about her experience with her education, and this is what she wants to share with you. She says, "The distance between my school and home is 4 kilometers, and the route is deserted. Because of this, I'm always afraid of abuse. Such incidences are common with girls these days. It's difficult to even imagine what kind of effect this would have on the victim. Such incidences are published every other day in the newspapers. This misbehavior happens while going to school, by teachers, or by any other person. Where are we safe after all? I would like to go to school if the school is friendly for girls and their honor and self-respect is safe, and if there are separate facilities for their personal safety." And I share that because I think first and foremost it's important to hear directly from youth about what their experience is like in their school, and oftentimes decision makers aren't hearing that perspective. So it's important for us to raise our voices. And there are nearly 124 million children worldwide who are not in school, and that's boys and girls. But we do know that investing in girls' education is investing in a more prosperous future. Not only for girls, but for our entire society, and that education plays a critical and a vital role in our security and our stability, in the economic growth and prosperity of our country and of our globe, and in better health outcomes for children and communities. Okay. Next slide.
Amber,
yes,
I just wanted to make one point too, because I've been working with ChildFun for 10 years, but prior to that, all of my work has been here in the U.S. So kind of being part of a global organization has given me an interesting insight. And one of the things I'm always kind of struck by is that even though in the U.S. it's not a matter of children actually have to go to school. That's kind of the law. And so but you cannot make the assumption that just because there is school for every child and it's not like huge numbers of children don't even get to go to school, it still does not ensure that that quality and equitable education. And I think in the U.S., as LaToya and Amber pointed out, a huge issue. Theirs is not, unfortunately, unique to just Jackson, but there's just too many. That is the story in the U.S. of inequality and kind of the haves and the have-nots and everything, and how, again, a huge segment of our population is just not it is not receiving or not have access to quality education.
That's so true and so powerful. And I'm just looking at the messages and seeing others agreeing with you, LaToya and Amber and Julia, in recognizing that even here in the U.S., in our communities, there are major barriers in access to quality education. And that's something that we do experience and we do see globally. And that when you speak to your member of Congress and decision makers, it's so important to share that personal experience and what that local education is like and what those local barriers are, and then relating that back to the experience of children in your community as well as in your country and throughout the world. Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate that valuable insight. And next slide, please. We can move on, and Julia and Amber and LaToya and others, please feel free to jump in here, but I just wanted to kick off. I know this topic can be a bit sensitive and wanted to clarify a definition. So when we talk about violence against children, we realize that that comes in many forms. You know, violence can take the form of abuse or neglect, exploitation. It can be physical, sexual, psychological, emotional. And violence occurs every single day in every country of the world. And even in the United States, in our own communities, in our homes especially, in schools. Children are enduring things like child labor, severe punishment, child marriage, trafficking, violence in schools we hear on the news every day. And these crimes against children not only harm the individuals themselves, but they also harm our families, our communities, our institutions, and at a global level, they undo the gains that we've been able to make in foreign assistance. They have an extremely high economic cost on society. So we know that here in the U.S. and in every one of our communities and in every one of our schools, as well as around the world, children are subject to, violence in alarming rates. And you'll see the picture of the world here that shows that the global economic impact of violence against children is as high as $7 trillion. And so, not to put anyone on the spot, but if there is anyone that would be interested in sharing, their experience about kind of what makes you feel safe, and what would you want to say to your leaders about the violence that children face in your school or in your communities?
Amber,
yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, please.
I would like to say that witnessing how violence can truly just harm a child in so many ways and cause so much trauma, it's really just immoral. It's not only it's unlawful and it's immoral, and it has to be a priority because, as you mentioned, it's harmful to the child, obviously, and it's harmful to everyone else.
Right.
So it gets to the point where you just have to, leaders have to have empathy and understand just how incredibly traumatizing it can be when children have to endure violence, whether that's, witnessing violence on the way to school or abuse in the home, any type of violence. It just has to be addressed. It has to be a priority because it's so wrong in itself, and it also harms, as we said, the community and the world.
It's so well said, Ariel. You're absolutely spot on in that, protecting children from violence is in the best interest of everyone. And the long-term exposure of violence on healthy development is just, it creates lifelong challenges, that can impact people's ability to form relationships and to make decisions. And one thing I'd like to point out is that said, children are extremely resilient. And, together with the right kind of supports, our children and our families and our schools and our communities, we can heal from this trauma that we've experienced, and we can prevent it from continuing. And so I'd like to leave you all here before we move on with kind of that call to action to recognize, as Ariel so eloquently mentioned, the real impact that violence against children has in our individual lives, but in our schools and in our communities and around the world, and to continue to connect what your personal experience has been in your family, in your school, in your community, with the experience of other children throughout the world. And one quote from Yemi in Honduras is that when children experience violence, the pain stays with them. When they grow up, they repeat the violence with others, and that has, that's a repeating cycle that we see oftentimes. And with the next slide, I will take you from that into sharing a bit about how you can to take a moment to kind of contemplate and think about what it means to be a global citizen. And we jumped from what is our personal experience in education and in violence in our communities, and then we heard from other youth throughout the world what their experience is like in that same area. And there is a video here. We're not able to show it due to technology, challenges, but we'll send around this presentation for distribution after, and I would encourage you to take a look at this very inspiring and powerful video that talks about how we can best represent ourselves and our community as well as the youth around the world. And I'll share one quote from a youth in Jackson. Her name is Zion, and she says that when asked what does it mean to her to be a global citizen, she says, being a global citizen to me means being educated and knowing about worldly problems and then trying to see if you can affect that and be part of something bigger than yourself. And that's so true. This is all about creating sustainable change in something that's bigger than ourselves. So next slide, please. We're going to jump in here a little bit more into the topic of advocacy and talking about some in-district strategies. So advocacy is the deliberate process of influencing people who are making decisions about an important issue that you care about. So when you're thinking about what are some of the who are some of the decision makers in your community or in your school that you can influence, and what are some of the examples of advocacy that you may have seen or participated in. There's a great quote here on the left from Nadia, also from Jackson, and she says, "The way I look at it, just because you're young doesn't mean our voice doesn't matter. We're the future. Our voice should count, and it doesn't in some things in our schools, in our country." And so, directly from Nadia, that's exactly why we do the work we do, to give a platform for youth to raise their voices and to influence decision makers into understanding the value that that voice has, the value that your voices have when you're influencing your schools and your communities and your members of Congress. Next slide, please. So when we advocate, we do so because it creates political will. We tell our elected officials and decision makers what their priorities should be, so you're setting the agenda. And if you want something to change, you have to ask for it. Our members of Congress are people just like us. They also need to be educated on these issues. And they found that in-person meetings with constituents is the most effective way to influence them and to educate them on issues that you're passionate about. And their job is to represent you. So they need to hear from you so that your voices can be taken into consideration in the decision-making process. And most importantly, we advocate because we need to create change. We know that all major changes in society, whether social or economic policy, whether they're good or bad, have happened because advocates have cared about an issue and have persisted until change happens. And I love this quote from Dr. Seuss from the Lorax on the side, which says, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not." And that's so true. And we advocate together in coalitions for greater impact. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through this stakeholder analysis very quickly because of time. I wanted to recognize that before we jump into the tactics, it's really important to understand who you're trying to influence so that you can tailor your tactics and your messages for influencing them. So an influencer is someone that has real or perceived credibility, power, or a platform to affect the decisions, the behaviors and attitudes and ideas of others. So on the left, there's a reminder here that these three images are showing the sources of power, the decision makers to impact policy, to impact funding, and to impact behaviors and attitudes of others. So your stakeholder analysis should identify who you're trying to target, what is their role in the policy process, what is their current level of knowledge or commitment to the issue, and then identify your tactics for influence. So next slide. So these are some key considerations to take into account when you're planning your in-district advocacy tactics. You'll want to first consider your audience, so understanding, again, your stakeholders and what they know about the issue, identifying what and who is more likely to persuade your influencer to act. So are they more persuaded by research and evidence or by personal stories? If they're a religious or a traditional leader, maybe that's an angle you'd like to take. So just thinking through all of your stakeholders and what tailored messages you can provide. And then lastly, what form of communication will get their attention? Maybe it's social media, it could be a face-to-face meeting or a public event. And with that said, we'll jump right into the tactics. So next slide, how to advance your advocacy goals in district. There's 3 things we'd like to touch on today. Is that with your larger advocacy goals or your policy goals, you can take 3 larger strategies or tactics or approaches. The first is direct advocacy, so you're influencing decision makers towards your policy goals. And we're going to break down each of these 3 strategies a bit further, but these are the larger buckets. So you can do direct advocacy, you can educate and empower, so this is social awareness building and community mobilization. And that would include things like issue education and media, as well as recruitment and mobilization of volunteers. And then lastly, we can't forget about fundraising, contributing to fundraising efforts that support your cause, because without resources, there aren't any programs. So it's important for us to advocate at the policy level, at the social level, and at the fundraising level. And next slide, please. We'll jump first into the policy advocacy tactics. So a quote here from Karen from the Philippines is, most of the time, leaders prioritize politics over children's welfare. Despite young people being regarded as the hope of the nation, leaders don't take issues that affect children seriously. And because that is the perception, we need to create platforms and demand that our voice be heard. So when we talk about direct advocacy, what we mean by that is lobbying with elected officials or government. So policy level tactics might include calling or writing or meeting with your member of Congress in district or on Capitol Hill, and this would require having a specific ask, on a legislative ask on issues that are important to you. You could petition your school board to influence decision making that impacts your school. You could show up at a mayor's local town hall meeting and ask very purposeful and insightful questions. Again, what we've heard from policymakers over time is that direct communication with them, direct meetings, is one of the most influential ways of informing and educating them on policy issues, but also in making your voice heard and ultimately being more effective in your lobbying. Another example is a policy brief. So you could do communications that are short and policy focused based on evidence and offer recommendations for policy solutions, and those typically have a reader-friendly format, so you could use those in the next topic area around communications as well. So I know we're jumping through these a bit quickly, but I'd love to get through them so that you can hear directly from LaToya and from Amber about how they've taken these tactics and practically applied them in Jackson. So next slide, please. This tool is extremely valuable when you're communicating with anyone, but especially with decision makers. This would be a way to go about designing an elevator pitch. It's called the Epic Laser Talk. And first you want to be engaging, using a personal story, invoking a value or a statistic. Then you want to state, what is your problem? So now that you've gotten the person's attention, you identify the problem that you want them to fix. And in doing so, you use language that leads to the solution that you want them to take. And you're creating a sense of urgency here. The I in the EPIC Laser Talk stands for informing or identifying solutions. And this is, developing your solution. You can develop your solution with examples of how and where it's worked in the past, or share, a recent story about your own experience. And then lastly, a call to action. So a yes or no question that really asks, what do you want me to do? So in policy advocacy, that is typically going to be something like co-sponsoring a piece of legislation or supporting a specific budget, or whatever it is that your ask might be. So this EPIC Laser Talk should be 2 minutes max, and like we said earlier, it's kind of like an elevator pitch. And I'm happy to send around a worksheet in the distribution of this PowerPoint that will help you craft and define your own EPIC Laser Talk for an issue that you're passionate about. When you're talking to a member of Congress or any decision maker, you really want to make it personal and share issues that you're passionate about, the experiences that have led to your passion about that issue, what you really want them to know about you and about the topic area and the issue that you're that you're speaking on. And so one exercise you can use is this personal narrative, and that looks at a character who faces a challenge and identifies an outcome, and it, just like a story, it outlines that plot. And so I'll also send a worksheet that will help you craft your personal narrative so that when you are talking to someone about an issue, you can really personalize it and talk about what that issue, the impact that that's had on you personally, and link it back to your community and then globally as well. Next slide. And we can skip this slide, Ariel. I'll jump into the social awareness building. Thank you. All right, so we've talked about policy advocacy as a strategy. Another strategy that you could look at for your in-district advocacy is around social awareness building. So this is going to include things like community mobilization, issue education, media communications, and you don't want to just pick one of these strategies. You can use all. You can use 1, 2, or 3, and they usually combine and support each other. So you'll be making direct legislative policy asks as well as using things like social media and community mobilization to gather support. So you want to always, think globally about the wider picture, but act locally. And some tactics include mobilizing and training volunteer advocates, building awareness through public events, partnering with local organizations or coalitions to inspire a call to action. You can utilize social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. You can write a blog or an op-ed or a letter to the editor. You could engage in public speaking, but most importantly, you're sharing your story. And so that storytelling, back to that personal narrative, is so important in connecting this issue from yourself to your community to the global community. And next slide, please, fundraising. As we mentioned, we need policy, we need social awareness building and education, and we need fundraising. So when you're fundraising, you want to be very specific about what you'd like them to raise the money for. Will it go towards a project that you're creating, or will you donate it back to an organization or a cause? You could host public events like film screenings or panel discussions. A couple of other ideas might be to incorporate fundraising into your events. So you could charge an entry fee, you could raffle off items or request donations. You could create a pledge or write a grant proposal. There's so many opportunities for creative fundraising, but that's the most important message, is to be creative and to have fun with it and to integrate your fundraising efforts into your community mobilization and into your event structures. So there's a way to host an education and a community mobilization event while fundraising for your activity and building support. So ultimately, change really starts with you. And I love this quote by Margaret Mead that says, "Never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Julia Campbell, to talk a little bit more about Operation Shoestring and the Youth Ambassador Program.
Thanks, Amber. I'm going to just say 2 things, and then I'm going to pass it on to LaToya and Amber because I want them to have some time, and I know we're running short on this. Just the point is that when we talked about advocacy and getting the young youth ambassadors involved in that, it was not, let's just have them do advocacy. It was part of a program model that ChildFun developed that came out of our kind of work for our older youth. If you want to go to the next slide, I'm just going to go through the next one a couple of really quickly. So this is kind of our model. That's, you can see there's different components of that model, and advocacy kind of falls under that youth action, but it also falls under like citizen knowledge and skills, and really all the way through their association representation. But there was these young people, and part of our program that we worked with our partner Operation Shoestring really kind of helped equip them so that they were in a better position to be able to do this advocacy and take action on some of these items. And you can see the first kind of components, the mapping, the youth civic engagement and leadership landscape, which included like that stakeholder analysis that Amber mentioned that is so important. And you want to go to the next slide, which this is just a mapping, kind of a results of the mapping that the youth in Jackson did of their community in terms of like what are the components that really impact their ability to bring about change. And they lovingly call this the spaghetti wall diagram, but anyway, that's kind of what that is. You can go on to the next one. So I think my main point was just to say that again, it wasn't just throwing young people out there and saying, go, speak to your elected officials and ask them to change things, that there was a lot of preparation that came out of our program model. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to LaToya and Amber. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amber May, and I'm the Programs Director at Operation Shoestring. And just kind of getting a little bit of our perspective in doing the engagement work with our youth ambassadors, especially as we prepare to advocate on behalf of the READ Act and then also a local ask. One thing I realized as we were preparing for that was that initially we were just really focused on the READ Act. But as we started having more conversations about education, the purpose of education, and are we providing quality education, we realized that we had a local ask as well. And that was to secure funding, some after-school program funding with the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Additionally, one thing that helped, as Amber mentioned earlier, that having that personal story to kind of to rely on, to help to communicate to your senators and congressmen or whomever you're talking to was really important. And one thing that we were able to do with the ambassadors was, as they were kind of going through some of those challenges that LaToya and I had mentioned earlier, and just kind of showing the importance of how we need to make sure that we have a quality education, and that, yes, we have the opportunity here in the United States, but that's also something that we're acting on behalf globally. So that's how we're able to connect our global and our local ads in terms of we're just talking about advocating for quality education for any and all students across the world. It was really a worthwhile experience, and as Julia said, advocacy was a major part of our civic youth engagement program. We did some activities locally and then also on Capitol Hill, and so LaToya is going to kind of detail what some of those specific activities were that were in for the READ Act, but also just for some of the things that we recognize that we want to change within our community. Next slide, please.
Yeah, like she was saying, my name is LaToya Washington, and at the time where we was on Washington, a lot of things came up for our students. There was a lot that they were able to use to apply to their life personally, which allowed the advocacy to be something really special for them. And a lot of things we were working on at home were honestly a part of the conversation that we was having in Washington as well. At the same time, Jackson and our students specifically were trying to uplift the voice of their other peers by going to schools and having focus groups and having different meetings within the community that could provide spaces for children be a valuable opinion in the space of education. Then when we went to Washington, there was even more of a level added to what we had already been doing in the space of now we talk to the people who make most of the heavy decisions, and that was a very impactful part, getting to know people, and also the skill building that we went through while we were there. Our students learning to use their stories and what makes them significant as a way to fight for themselves, and that helped them connect with what they were doing, so it wasn't just a task for them, it was something they actually wanted to and were passionate about. And a lot of things that came up was like when it connecting to local to global, we had to understand there's different communities, and while we may not be in the same space, we may have similar experiences. And especially with what Amber Stone mentioned earlier about abuse and different types of struggle, everybody has been a subject to something, a victim of something, exposed to something. So finding those spaces where there people are like you. Another example of this would be like the Me Too movement, where you find people who have experienced something similar to you, and you use that as a way to advocate for you and them and change in whatever system that you're being exposed to that is unfair or can use improvement. And the ambassadors know all too well how youth voice is neglected within major educational decisions, so they were able to easily understand and speak for others in the space of education, and they used their voices to say a lot of things that we think a lot of other students wanted to say as well. And some other activities that we're currently doing, we recently had a Youth Voice Day, and on Youth Voice Day, kind of just to do something that hasn't really happened, which is celebrate youth. There's not a big space that I have identified that just celebrates youth and who they are and what they bring to environments. So Friday of last week, we launched a Facebook event where we just continually posted achievements and accomplishments of JPS students. We reached about 1,200 people, which was really good because we were expecting for people to not be as open to it, but because of the youth and because of how supportive Jackson is becoming of the youth, we were able to reach a lot more people and just show the Jackson youth how important and how proud of them we are. And we also have been working in relationship with JPS school board during the recent potential state takeover that Amber May mentioned earlier, and what we could do with them to possibly make sure that Jackson grows as a school district in a way that makes a state takeover less likely, and that we use the power that we have locally to establish a better community for everybody else. But it's really just a lot of trying to find things that you understand to be important and values that you identify within yourself, and fighting for them in the best way that you can, while realizing that you're not the only one, that other people have been exposed to similar circumstances, and everybody could benefit from you advocating for this or what you feel passionate about.
Right. And one additional thing, additional activity that we really found was important for us to do was to create as many avenues of student voice as possible, and not just only the student voice of the ambassadors, but the student voice of the students inside their schools. So in addition to the focus groups that we did last year, we just recently submitted a survey to our local schools asking for high school and middle school students to kind of answer 7 key questions, just kind of talking about what their schools are like, for us to utilize and for us to analyze and really publish a report around this is the perspective that student has on school. So sometimes the advocacy, our advocacy efforts, as Amber listed up earlier, is providing information so that the people can make more informed decisions around things that have an effect on youth. Because even though, you know, the condition of the schools, you will automatically think, yes, that's something that that's going to affect you, they should most definitely be at the table. That's not necessarily always happening. And we kind of see that as our kind of responsibility and call to action to make sure that that voice is at the table. Okay.
Thank you so much, LaToya, Amber, for sharing your inspiring story and the work that you're doing with Youth Ambassadors in Jackson. I'd love to invite our participants here to unmute yourself and to ask any questions that you may have of LaToya or Amber, Julia, or myself on any of the in-district advocacy strategies or support in making that local to global connection. So we are here for you.
This is Jennifer. I just want to say thank you so very much for sharing your insights. And I do have a question. Operation Shoestring and the community in Jackson has been doing such amazing work. How would you recommend for communities and campuses, school districts, where it might be a smaller number of youth advocates, or for a group that's just starting out, what suggestions would you have for effective advocacy to, you know, that really builds on your experience and what you've learned along the way?
So a couple of kind of things that come up for me, and that number one is I think education is one of the key things. So if having opportunities to go to school board meetings just to kind of hear what are some of the things that they are discussing, and then to offer any remarks around the public comment section, that's a really good time. You have a couple of students that want to go and participate in that. I think at any point in time that there happen to be any town hall meetings or any other convenings, to make sure that you all are there in that meeting, and then having conversations prior to regarding what are some of the things that you want to make sure is lifted up. I think sometimes those school-sponsored meetings, they have a very set agenda, but that does not necessarily mean you cannot voice what some of the things are you want to say. Also, tapping into the parents of the students that you work with is also important. So parents can advocate on behalf of their child, and they sometimes are invited in spaces that youth are not. Submitting op-ed pieces is something that you can do if you don't have a lot of students, and that's something that you can publish and get, put within the newspaper. And so those are just a couple of, I think, strategies if you don't necessarily have a large number of students that we can do, because with the ambassadors, we have about 40 students. And then just having the students to, have conversations or engage in conversations with other students in their schools, especially students they may not necessarily know, because you want to make sure that we're as informed as possible going forth, especially if we're saying that we're operating in the voice of students. So having conversations is important. The students are teaching me the magic of Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook. I don't use it, but they use it prolifically, and we've been able to do some wonderful things with the social media that a lot of the youth are using these days.
Yeah, I would just reiterate on what they were saying in terms of how it's really important that there's an intentional mechanism kind of built into it's not just the recognized advocates, youth advocates or leaders, that they actually are representing the voice of their peers, whatever that, in this context of peers in their schools. And so there needs to be an intentional mechanism, as they gave you a couple of examples of surveying students, having focus groups but this constant regular input, so that that in itself has been so hugely important. And the participants of those focus groups were just saying, gosh, nobody ever asked us this. We never get a chance to have that say, and that in itself is such a powerful, I think, motivator for that many more young people becoming advocates and stepping up and taking action and voicing their opinion.
Yes, I agree with that statement. I think it's critical to always have youth involved in the decision making and to help youth to understand that they are empowered to use their voices. Absolutely.
Right. Well,
other questions or comments that they'd like to share, feel free to put them in the chat box. We're kind of nearing the end right now, but this has been a great discussion. Amber, did you have any other comments? Anything that you would like to share with the group?
Sure, just to say thank you for your time and for your attention, and thank you to Operation Shoestring, to Amber, LaToya, and also to Julia for sharing your valuable insight. And I will leave the group with this quote by Eileen Campbell from International Justice Mission. And she says that as Americans, we have an incredible privilege, which is to tell our elected leaders what matters to us. And if enough of us care about the same thing and we work together, then we can actually build up enough power to create change, even change the course of history. And I'd just like to leave you all with feeling inspired that you raising your voice is a first step to creating lasting change in your communities, in your schools, in your cities, and in your nation and across the globe. So thank you for raising your voice and for representing other youth. We look forward to seeing you all in June when you join us in DC. So thank you. And thank you, Ariel and Jennifer and GCE for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, ChildFun. Thank you, Operation Shoestring. This has been wonderful. I will send out information to participants after the session. Thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions, you can email abrown@gce-us.org, and we look forward to you joining us for the summit. Have a great day. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
All right, thank you.
This was wonderful.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.